And it's at this point that Carlsen's opponent goes wrong after keeping the game equal for the longest time.
ChessDiagnostic.
Hello everybody and welcome back for another video. Today we're going to look at a game that Carlsen played recently in the King Salman World Blitz Championship, which he won. And this is a game that Carlsen's white against Ivan Popov, probably a Russian or Ukrainian grandmaster who's playing at 2600 level. And it's really interesting how normal the game seems. And Carlsen doesn't really do anything special, but he just plays very solidly and he manages to win by a blunder at the end of a bishop endgame. So I just want to show the whole game. We'll just go through it quick. I'm not going to comment on every move. It starts with e4 just to see how the game progresses. c5. And we just see normal, really not an aggressive Sicilian defense. Carlsen takes with the d-pawn. And then we just see normal development here. Looks like maybe he's going to plan to castle queenside, but in the end, he decides to just play solidly, gaining space. Each opponent's gaining space, developing. And then he castles kingside in the end. And now we see an interesting decision here to take with the pawn, which obviously gives white a doubled pawn, but also gives him the open b file, as well as the chance to play c4 and control more squares, namely the d5 square, which is very important in this game. All right, so this square is controlled. Now black doesn't have really the ability to break himself free, and this pawn's pretty weak. But otherwise, a normal game. Some normal development moves. The rook comes in. And white gets this pawn, but actually it's pretty equal. There's some weaknesses by white too, this c4 pawn. And now the queen can take. And really, white's not strong enough to keep this pawn moving forward. Black's going to win it, and he'll just give away this pawn in exchange. All right, so we see a trade. And now after a few moves here, offering a queen trade, c4, there was an interesting move, bishop to c7 by black, which wasn't played. And the reason for that is because now the white rook is in a precarious position and the threat is knight to d4, obviously cutting off the connection between the queen and the rook, and then black can take the rook. And if the rook goes rook to e7, obviously that's pretty dangerous. But black didn't play that move. Instead we just see here, and then he takes with the pawn. Alright, so really nothing special about this game until we get to the endgame, which is of interest. Now Carlsen is dead equal in this game. There's no advantage by either side, and a lot of grandmasters would just agree to a draw. Alright, so we're just going to keep playing here. Trade. And now black offers a queen trade, and then Carlsen takes. Both kings come into the game, and this play right here is quite interesting. So instead of just taking and allowing black to get more space and more initiative, he plays just the quiet move, attacking the pawn, forcing weaknesses by black. And now after f4 and takes, we see that black is now the defender in this position. He's going to have to worry about these weak pawns. And it's equal, but it's a lot harder for black to play. So these practical decisions by Carlsen is what he uses to beat a 2600 player and make him blunder after a lot of pressure. So that's another key thing in endgames, is to maintain the pressure. Not necessarily that it will give you a hard advantage in a game, but your opponent might crack. A computer wouldn't, but your opponent might. So let's see what happens here. Now Carlsen just plays with his opponent, tries to move over, and get in here, but black made the correct decision to keep the white king out by bringing his own king over. And it looks like black can take this pawn, but actually it's kind of a trick. Now if black takes, white takes, and the problem is that white will move and keep pressure on this pawn, force his own pawn, and because white's own passed pawn is all the way on the other side of the board, black will have to bring his king over, and it'll be too late. By the time white wins this pawn and stops this pawn, he'll be able to queen. So that would be a winning advantage for white. So we don't see that. Again, this is another trick that Carlsen would use against any player to force a blunder. So really this is what we're talking about when we're talking about Carlsen's endgame mastery. It's not necessarily technical, but he knows endgame so well that he can set up these psychological tricks and blunders that his opponent has to wade through. All right, just keeping the white king out, and then Carlsen decides to, again, come over and further frustrate his opponent. So black can just shuffle his king, and there's really no way that white can make any progress. But here we see an interesting blunder by black. He must have thought that he could just keep this pawn and keep a draw. Black really should have just played king to f7, and then if they take, black can just shuffle his king to wherever the white king's going, and there's no progress that can be made. But we see bishop takes, a rather shocking blunder by 2600, but it seems that he thought he could just keep the black king out, but Carlsen understands these king and pawn endgames better. So this is a very interesting example of what I've been talking about, of trading into a lost king and pawn endgame. This one's a little harder, but Carlsen knows that he can give away this pawn. And we see what I was talking about earlier. After taking this pawn, the pawn comes forward, and now we see exactly what I was talking about in a previous video, where once the king moves forward, white will queen with check on the f5 square. And at this point, black resigned because obviously if he moves forward, we see these moves. And it's actually 2 moves ahead. Check. Black doesn't even get to the e2 square. So game over. Very interesting game and illustration of how Carlsen beats his opponents in dead equal endgames, forcing blunders and playing psychological tricks. And hopefully, if you understand endgames well enough, you'll be able to do that to your own opponents. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.